I was 12 years old when I found the letter, and I was 31 years old when I finally understood what the letter had been trying to tell. Me and the distance between those two ages is where this entire story lives, in the gap between a child who knew something was wrong and a woman who finally had the language to say what it was. Because when you grow up in a house where love is distributed unevenly, you learn very early that what you are experiencing does not have a name, or rather that the people around you will not give it a name. Will call it sensitivity or imagination or ingratitude before they will call it what it actually is, which is a child being taught by daily accumulation that she is the lesser version, the backup plan, the one whose needs are the flexible variable in every family equation. And I was that child. My name is Claire. I was 12 years old, and the letter I found was not written to me, but about me. And reading it on the floor of my mother's closet where I had gone to find a spare blanket on a cold November evening changed something in my nervous system that would take me nearly 2 decades to fully understand. My mother had written the letter to my aunt, her sister, who lived far enough away that they still wrote actual letters, sometimes handwritten on the pale blue stationery my mother kept in the second drawer of her desk, and the letter was unfinished, unsent, folded once and left in the pocket of a cardigan that was hanging in her closet. And I found it because the blanket I was looking for was on the high shelf above the cardigans, and I knocked the cardigan, reaching for it, and the letter fell, and I picked it up because I was 12 and it was there, and I read it because I was 12 and I did not yet know that some things cannot be unknown once you know them. The letter talked about my sister Emma, first the way my mother's letters always arranged themselves, Emma first, Claire somewhere in the middle or toward the end, and the things she wrote about Emma were warm and specific and proud. Emma had done well in her recital. Emma had made a new friend who seemed like a good influence. Emma was really coming into herself this year. You would love her right now. Diane, she is becoming such a lovely young woman. And then there was a paragraph about me, and the paragraph about me said, Claire is Claire. You know how she is still so much going on in that head of hers, still so intense about everything her teacher says. She is bright, but I sometimes wonder if all that intensity is going to make things harder for her. She doesn't make things easy, and I worry sometimes that she doesn't know how. And that was all. Claire is Claire, still so intense, doesn't make things easy. And I stood in my mother's closet at 12 years old holding pale blue stationery, and I read those words 3 times to make sure I had read them correctly, and then I folded the letter exactly as I had found it and put it back in the cardigan pocket and got the blanket from the shelf and went back to my room and lay down on my bed and stared at the ceiling and felt something in my chest do something. I did not have a name for a tightening, a closing, a pressure that would become familiar over the following months as my body a way of processing things my mind was not ready to process. As the first of many panic attacks that would follow me through adolescence and into my 20s like a shadow I could not lose no matter how fast I moved. I did not tell anyone about the letter. Who would I have told? My mother, who wrote it, my sister Emma, who was becoming such a lovely young woman. My father, who loved us both but moved through our house like a man who had long ago decided that the interior weather of his family was something he could observe without being required to intervene. I told no one, and I carried it the way you carry something heavy when no one is offered to help, and you have stopped expecting them to. Quietly and with a posture adjusted to the weight. What I understood at 12 was the surface of it, that my mother found me difficult, that Emma was easier, that something about the way I was made did not fit the shape of what my mother had wanted. And what I did with that understanding was what 12-year-olds do when they receive information that their nervous systems cannot fully metabolize. I adapted. I attempted to become less intense, less complicated, less the thing the letter described. I tried to make things easy in all the ways I had apparently been failing to. And for a while I thought it was working because my mother seemed less tired around me, seemed more comfortable. And then I understood much later in a therapist's office at 27 that what had actually happened was that I had made myself smaller, had compressed the parts of myself that took up too much space, had learned to perform a version of Claire that was easier to be around by quietly suffocating the version that was real. The panic attacks were worst in the mornings before school, in the window between waking up and leaving the house, in the 20 minutes when I was most likely to encounter my mother in the kitchen and be measured against Emma, without anyone acknowledging the measuring was happening, and I developed an extensive series of strategies for managing them. Alone in my bedroom or in the school bathroom, counting tiles, counting breaths, pressing my back against cold surfaces, all the private technologies of a child who has learned that her distress is an inconvenience and has therefore decided to make it invisible. Emma was not cruel to me. I want to say that clearly because she is part of this story and she deserves accuracy. Emma was simply the child my mother found easier, and she inhabited that position the way anyone inhabits an advantage. They were born into, without full awareness of its cost to the person adjacent to them. And we were not close in the way sisters in movies are close, but we were not enemies either. We were two people who shared a house and a mother and very little else, moving in parallel lines that occasionally touched but never quite merged. The years passed the way years do when you are surviving them, rather than living them efficiently and without much joy, and I left home at 17 for a university place I had worked extremely hard to get, driven partly by genuine ambition and partly by the bone-deep need to be somewhere that my worth was not determined by comparison to my sister. And in that new city, I slowly, cautiously began the process of finding out who Claire actually was when Claire was not being measured against Emma, when Claire was not trying to make things easy, when Claire was allowed to be intense about things without someone finding it worrying. The panic attacks followed me to university because of course they did. They were not about the house, they were about the wiring, about a nervous system that had learned too young that it was not entirely safe, and I managed them. Alone for 2 more years before a friend named Sophie, who was studying psychology, sat across from me in the library one afternoon and said very quietly, "Have you ever talked to anyone about the anxiety?" And I said, "What anxiety?" And she looked at me with an expression that told me she had been watching me manage it for months, and she said, "Claire, it's okay to need help with this," and I started crying immediately. In the library, which was mortifying and also the beginning of something. Therapy took years and was not linear, and there were sessions that felt like excavation and sessions that felt like nothing, and sessions where I sat in a chair and talked about my mother, and sessions where I sat in a chair and couldn't talk about my mother, and sessions where I finally said out loud, "She wrote that I didn't make things easy, and she was right that it was hard for me. But I understand now that easy was never mine to give her, because easy would have required me to be someone other than who I am. And who I am is not a problem to be managed." And my therapist said, "Say that again," and I said it again. And something shifted that had been locked for a very long time. I told my mother about the letter when I was 29, which was 17 years after I had found it, and folded it back exactly as I had found it, and said nothing. And the conversation was not what I had rehearsed in my head. It was quieter and stranger and more human than the version I had practiced. Because my mother sat across from me and listened, and when I finished, she did not defend herself the way I had braced for. She sat with it, and then she said, "I don't remember writing that, but I believe you that I did." And I said, "What do you mean you believe me?" And she said, "I mean that I was not always paying attention to how I was speaking about you, and I should have been, and I'm sorry." And the apology did not undo 17 years. But it also did not bounce off the way I had expected it to. It landed somewhere and stayed, imperfect and real, and more than I had let myself hope for. I am 31 now, and Emma and I talk more than we used to, carefully, in the way of two people who are learning each other without the architecture of childhood around them. And sometimes she says things that tell me she was not entirely unaware of the dynamic we grew up inside, that she had her own complicated feelings about being the easier one. That ease has its own costs that I had not considered, and those conversations are the most interesting ones I have ever had with her, because they are the first ones where we are both telling the truth. My mother and I are not fixed, we are in progress, which is a different and more honest thing, and sometimes she says something that lands wrong and I feel the old tightening in my chest. And I breathe through it now. Instead of hiding it, I breathe through it, and sometimes I tell her, "That landed wrong for me," and she sits with that, imperfectly and with some discomfort, but genuinely. And I have decided that genuine and imperfect is what I am willing to work with, because the alternative is nothing, and nothing is not something I am willing to choose. What I know now that I did not know at 12 is that Claire as Claire was not a dismissal of who I was. It was a description of my mother's limitation, her inability to meet the specific intensity of me, her failure to understand that the thing she called difficult was actually just a child who felt things deeply and needed someone to stay in the room with that instead of finding it worrying, and I was that child. And now I am a woman who has spent a long time learning to stay in the room with herself. And the panic attacks are rare now, and when they come, I know their name, and I know they pass, and I know they are not evidence of something broken in me, but evidence of something that learned too early to brace for impact, and I'm very slowly, very deliberately, teaching it that the impact is not coming anymore, that it is safe now to uncurl, that Claire is Claire and Claire is, it turns out, exactly enough.